Thank you for tuning into our channel. We appreciate your company and are excited to dive into another story about infidelity. So without further delay, let's get started. Marcus Steele's pager suddenly buzzed, shattering the quiet of the hospital hallway. He glanced at the small screen, his eyes widening as he read the message, "Trauma incoming." All hands on deck. Without missing a beat, he sprinted down the corridor, his white coat flowing behind him like a cape. His polished shoes squeaked against the pristine floors as he burst through the double doors into the operating room. "What's the situation?" he demanded, extending his arms as a nurse helped him into a surgical gown. 8-year-old girl, multiple cuts, possible internal bleeding, car accident. The head nurse Sarah responded quickly, her calm, focused eyes visible above her mask. Marcus nodded, his mind already racing through various scenarios as he smoothly pulled on his latex gloves. A fleeting thought of Vanessa crossed his mind. She had been distant lately, frequently cancelling dinner plans, but he shoved the thought aside. He'd deal with that later. "Vitals?" he asked, moving towards the operating table where the girl lay, dwarfed by the surrounding medical equipment. "Dropping fast," another nurse replied. 85/60 and falling. Marcus's expression tightened with determination. "We need to stop the internal bleeding immediately." Scalpel. The next few hours blurred into a rush of focused concentration. Marcus worked with precision, his hands steady as he navigated the young girl's injuries. The rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of machinery formed the backdrop to the tense life or death battle happening on the operating table. "More suction," Marcus ordered, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "We've got a bleeder." The team moved seamlessly, anticipating Marcus's needs before he could even articulate them. Time seemed to both stretch and compress, minutes dragging like hours, hours slipping by like minutes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus stepped back from the table, pulling off his mask to reveal a face etched with exhaustion but glowing with triumph. "We've stabilized her," he announced, his voice raspy but filled with satisfaction. "She's going to make it." A collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. Sarah patted Marcus on the back. "Another life saved, Dr. Steele. You're a miracle worker." Marcus shook his head humbly. It was a team effort. "We all saved her." As he left the operating room, peeling off his gown and gloves, his thoughts shifted to home. He looked forward to telling Vanessa about the successful surgery, hoping it would help bridge the growing distance between them and give them something to reconnect over. The drive home was quick, the quiet suburban streets almost empty in the late evening. As Marcus pulled into his driveway, he noticed an unfamiliar red sports car parked across the street, oddly out of place among the usual family vehicles. He frowned briefly but shrugged it off, likely a visitor to one of the neighbors. Climbing out of his car, his body sore from hours of concentration, all he wanted was a hot shower, a cold beer, and maybe some quality time with Vanessa. It had been far too long since they really talked. The moment Marcus opened the front door, he heard hushed voices from the living room. His frown deepened as he moved toward the sound. The secrecy in the tone made his nerves tingle with unease. "Vanessa," he called, announcing his presence. There was a sudden rustling, followed by Vanessa's voice, high-pitched and startled. "Marcus, you're home early." Stepping into the living room, Marcus took in the scene. Vanessa sat on the edge of the couch, looking tense, her face flushed. Beside her was Garrett Sloan, their neighbor and Vanessa's yoga instructor. The awkward body language and guilty glances that flashed between them set off warning bells in Marcus's mind. "I just performed a life-saving surgery," Marcus said, pride mingling with suspicion. "I thought we could celebrate." Vanessa's response was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear," she said, not quite meeting his eyes as her fingers nervously twisted in her lap. "Garrett and I were just discussing yoga techniques." Marcus noticed the shared guilty look but chose not to comment. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, but years of handling high-stakes situations in the operating room had taught him to stay calm under pressure. "I see," he said evenly. "Don't let me interrupt. I'll be in my study if you need me." As he turned to leave, he overheard Garrett's smug whisper, clearly not intended for his ears. He doesn't suspect a thing. The words hit Marcus like a punch, but he kept walking, his mind spinning with thoughts he didn't want to entertain. What exactly didn't he suspect? And why did Garrett sound so pleased? In his study, Marcus sank into his leather chair, his earlier triumph eclipsed by this new crisis. He stared blankly at the medical journals on his desk, his mind replaying the scene, the guilty looks, the hushed voices, Vanessa's shocked reaction to his early arrival. None of it boded well. A few minutes later, he heard the front door close and the sound of a car starting. Garrett was leaving, Marcus assumed. Then Vanessa's soft footsteps approached the study. "Marcus," she called gently, peeking her head around the door. "I'm heading to bed. Are you coming up?" Marcus searched her face for any sign of guilt or remorse, but all he saw was a carefully blank expression, which somehow made everything worse. "I'll be up soon," he replied. "Just need to review some patient files." Vanessa nodded and left, leaving Marcus alone with his swirling thoughts and suspicions. The next morning, Marcus woke to find the bed beside him empty and cold. He frowned, glancing at the clock, barely 7 a.m. On a Saturday. Vanessa usually slept in on weekends. He found her in the kitchen, already dressed in yoga gear, keys in hand, and heading for the door. "Where are you off to so early?" he asked, keeping his tone casual despite the tightening knot of suspicion in his stomach. Vanessa startled, nearly dropping her keys. "Oh, Marcus." "I didn't realize you were up," Vanessa said, her voice unnaturally high. "I have a doctor's appointment." Marcus's suspicions, which had been simmering all night, began to intensify. At 7 a.m., on a Saturday, he pressed, unable to hide the skepticism in his tone. It was the only time they had available. Vanessa responded evasively, avoiding eye contact as she fumbled with her purse, clearly eager to leave. "I've got to go. I don't want to be late." As the door closed behind her, Marcus made a split-second decision. He quickly threw on jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed his keys, and followed her, keeping a discreet distance in his car. The early morning streets were nearly deserted, making it hard to tail her without being noticed. Marcus's heart raced, part of him hoping he was wrong, that there was a simple explanation for all of this. But to his dismay, he watched as Vanessa pulled into the parking lot of a plain building. The sign outside read "Fertility Clinic." His heart sank further when he spotted Garrett's flashy red sports car already parked there. Moments later, Vanessa and Garrett walked into the clinic together, Garrett's hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture far too intimate for Marcus's comfort. Sitting in his car, Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The implications were overwhelming, but he forced himself to stay rational. There had to be an explanation there, just had to be. Shaking off the shock, he drove to the hospital, trying to throw himself into his work to block out the troubling thoughts racing through his mind. The day passed in a blur of patient surgeries and paperwork. His colleagues noticed his distraction but attributed it to exhaustion from the previous night's emergency surgery. "You okay, Steele, Dr. Thompson?" the chief of surgery asked during a brief encounter. "You seem a bit off today." Forcing a smile, Marcus replied, "Just tired from last night's marathon surgery. I'll be fine." As evening approached, Marcus prepared himself for the inevitable confrontation waiting at home. As soon as he walked through the door, he called out, "Vanessa, we need to talk." She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face a mask of forced calm. But Marcus could see the tension in her posture. "About what?" Taking a deep breath, Marcus decided to get straight to the point. "I saw you at the fertility clinic with Garrett this morning. What's going on?" For a moment, shock flashed across Vanessa's face, quickly replaced by defiance. The facade of innocence fell away like a discarded mask. "Fine," she snapped. "I wanted to keep this private, but since you're prying, Garrett and I want to have a baby together. I was hoping you'd be okay with me being a surrogate for his child." Marcus was stunned. The room seemed to spin around him as Vanessa's words echoed in his ears. "You can't be serious," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "You're my wife." "I'm an independent woman," Vanessa retorted coldly. "I can do whatever I want with my body. If you can't handle that, maybe we shouldn't be together." Words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach, the air knocked out of him. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. "Does it matter?" Vanessa's chin jutted out in defiance. "Garrett understands me in ways you never have. He supports my choices, my independence." Marcus laughed bitterly. "And I don't. I've always supported your career, your hobbies. I've never tried to hold you back." "It's not about holding me back," Vanessa snapped. "It's about truly seeing me, understanding what I need." "And what you need is to have another man's baby," Marcus shot back, his calm facade to crack. "It's not like that," Vanessa argued, her eyes flashing. "Garrett can't have children of his own. I'm helping a friend." "A friend," Marcus repeated incredulously. "Is that what we're calling it now?" From there, the conversation spiraled into a heated argument, years of unspoken resentment and misunderstandings finally coming to the surface. By the time it ended, Marcus felt emotionally drained, as though he had just finished a 48-hour shift at the hospital. The days that followed were filled with a suffocating silence. Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed focus, saving lives and earning praise at the hospital. It was easier to concentrate on other people's suffering than face his own. "You're on fire lately, Steele," Dr. Thompson remarked after Marcus completed a particularly challenging surgery. "Whatever's driving you, keep it up." Marcus simply nodded, not trusting himself to speak. If only his colleague knew that his professional success was being fueled by personal turmoil. At home, Vanessa became increasingly distant, making no effort to hide her frequent meetings with Garrett. She came and went as she pleased, without offering any explanations. One evening, Marcus arrived home earlier than usual due to a scheduling error. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Garrett's red sports car parked in front of the house. Taking a deep breath, he braced himself for what was inside. What he found in the living room made his blood boil. Garrett was lounging comfortably on the couch Marcus and Vanessa had picked out together when they first moved in. Garrett's arm was draped possessively over Vanessa's shoulders. Both of them looked up as Marcus entered, Garrett's face twisting into a smug sneer. "Face it," Doc Garrett drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can't give Vanessa what she needs. Step aside, like a good boy." Something inside Marcus snapped. The weeks of stress, betrayal, and anger crystallized into cold resolve. In a dangerously quiet voice, he said, "Get out of my house, now." Garrett's smirk faltered, but he didn't move. Marcus turned to Vanessa, his eyes blazing with fury she had never seen before. "Pack your things," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're leaving too." "You can't kick me out," Vanessa protested, jumping to her feet. Her face was a mix of shock and indignation. "This is my home too." But Marcus's voice was like steel. "Not anymore. I've already contacted my lawyer. Expect divorce papers soon." The finality in his tone seemed to stun both Vanessa and Garrett into action. As they hurriedly packed Vanessa's belongings, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The life they had built together was unraveling, and there was no turning back. As they left, arms full of hastily gathered bags, Garrett couldn't resist one final jab. "You'll regret this, Steele," he called, his earlier smugness replaced with barely hidden anger. "I've got friends in high places." Marcus calmly closed the door, shutting out their voices and the life he once knew. As the lock clicked into place, he leaned against the door, feeling the weight of his exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, a steely determination took hold. He walked through the now eerily quiet and empty house, the silence settling around him like a heavy fog. In the kitchen, Marcus found a bottle of scotch hidden in the back of a cupboard. He rarely indulged in alcohol, but tonight felt like as good a time as any to start. As he poured himself a glass, his gaze fell on a framed photo sitting on the counter. It was from his wedding day with Vanessa, both of them smiling brightly at the camera, filled with hope for their future together. In a sudden burst of anger, he slammed the frame face down on the counter and sank into a chair at the kitchen table. Marcus took a long swig, savoring the burn of the scotch as it slid down his throat. His mind began to formulate a plan, Garrett's parting words, "friends in high places," echoing in his head. Well, Marcus thought, two could play at that game. The following weeks dragged on like injured animals, slow and agonizing. Marcus Steele's life had become an unending cycle of surgeries, hospital rounds, and sleepless nights. The house that once felt like a refuge now seemed like a museum of his failed marriage, with every corner holding memories he desperately wanted to erase. He buried himself in his work, approaching it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His colleagues noticed the change, sensing the heat of his focus like the warmth radiating from a furnace. "Steele, you're on fire," Dr. Thompson remarked one day after Marcus completed a particularly difficult thoracic surgery. "I've never seen anything like it." Marcus merely nodded, unable to trust himself to speak. If they only knew the inferno that raged inside him, fueling each precise incision, every careful suture. His reputation at the hospital soared, and whispers in the corridors spoke of his almost supernatural ability to save patients others had given up on. Best surgeon in the state, they said. But to Marcus, it was all just background noise, a distraction from the emptiness gnawing at his soul. But even surgery wasn't enough. Marcus needed more, something beyond the sterile walls of the operating room, to feel like he was making a difference. That's how he found himself at the local community center one rainy Tuesday evening. "Are you sure about this, Dr. Steele Maria?" the center coordinator asked. "These kids, they're not easy to handle." Marcus glanced at the group of teenagers slouched in their chairs, their eyes filled with distrust and barely concealed hostility. He saw a bit of himself in them, the anger, the hurt, the sense of being lost in a world that didn't care. "I'm sure," he replied, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's start with basic first aid. You never know when you might need to save a life." As he demonstrated how to apply pressure to a wound, using a mannequin for practice, he caught the eye of one boy. There was a flicker of interest there, something that resembled hope. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that wasn't fueled by rage or betrayal. This, he realized, was what true healing felt like. The sessions at the community center became a lifeline for Marcus, tethering him to something outside his personal turmoil. He taught first aid, mentored the teens, and listened to their stories. Slowly, almost without noticing, he began to heal. But the past wasn't finished with him yet. One evening, after a long shift at the hospital, Marcus noticed a sleek black car idling in the parking lot as he approached his vehicle. As he drew closer, the car's engine roared to life. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, fingers closing around his keys as the black car pulled out, trailing behind him as he left the lot. Glancing in the rearview mirror, Marcus recognized the face behind the wheel, Garrett Sloan, grinning like a predator that had just caught the scent of its prey. But instead of fear, Marcus felt something else: anticipation. The game, it seemed, was on. He drove calmly, steering away from home and heading toward a crowded shopping center. Garrett followed, keeping a careful distance. Marcus parked near the entrance of a large bookstore and wandered inside, pretending to browse the medical section, keeping an eye on Garrett, who was unsuccessfully trying to blend in near the self-help aisle. Marcus moved closer, ostensibly reaching for a book from a high shelf, and overheard a pair of nurses from his hospital chatting in the next row. "Did you hear about Dr. Sloan?" one whispered, her voice heavy with scandal. "Apparently he's been writing fake prescriptions." "No way," the other nurse gasped. "I always knew something was off about him." "It's true. My cousin works in the pharmacy. She said they've been getting a bunch of suspicious scripts, all signed by Dr. Sloan." Marcus's ears perked up. He had just uncovered Garrett's weak spot. As he watched Garrett slink out of the bookstore, Marcus allowed himself a small, grim smile. The tables were about to turn. From that moment on, Marcus Steele was a man on a mission. The information he overheard at the bookstore was just the beginning. He began his investigation with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complicated procedure. Late nights were spent at his computer, following digital trails. He called in favors from old colleagues and whispered quietly with pharmacists, piecing together a disturbing puzzle about Garrett Sloan's activities. It turned out Garrett wasn't just a yoga instructor. He had reinvented himself as a holistic healer, blending Eastern mysticism with Western medicine, a combination that appealed to a certain type of affluent, bored suburban woman, the kind Vanessa had become, Marcus thought bitterly. But Garrett's services went beyond yoga poses and chakra alignments. He had been prescribing opioids to his yoga clients, feeding their addictions under the guise of pain management and spiritual enlightenment. Marcus's stomach churned as he delved deeper into Garrett's scheme. The man was nothing more than a glorified drug pusher, exploiting the despair and suffering of vulnerable people. As Marcus gathered his evidence, copies of prescriptions, statements from pharmacists, and even a recorded conversation with one of Garrett's clients, he felt a grim satisfaction. He was determined to bring Garrett down, not just for personal revenge, but because it was the right thing to do. Yet, life had a way of complicating things. One evening, his phone buzzed with an unknown number flashing on the screen. Against his better judgment, Marcus picked up. Marcus came a soft, hesitant voice. "Vanessa? What do you want?" The coldness in his own voice surprised him. "Can we talk, please?" I've made a terrible mistake." Part of him wanted to hang up, severing the last remaining tie to his past. But curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of what they once shared, convinced him to meet. They picked a neutral spot, a small cafe downtown, far from their usual places. When Marcus arrived, he spotted Vanessa right away. She seemed different, somehow smaller, diminished. The vibrant, confident woman he had once married had been replaced by a fragile shadow of herself. "I've made a terrible mistake, Marcus," she said as soon as he sat down, skipping any formalities. "Can we fix things?" Marcus studied her, noticing the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremble in her hands as she held her coffee. For a brief moment he felt a pang of the old affection, a protective instinct, but then the memories flooded back, the lies, the betrayal. "Garrett." His voice was gentle but firm when he answered. "No, Vanessa, you made your choice. I hope you find happiness, but it won't be with me." He saw the hope drain from her eyes, replaced by quiet resignation. As he stood to leave, his gaze drifted outside, catching a familiar figure lurking in the shadows across the street. Garrett, watching with a face twisted in rage. Marcus walked out of the cafe feeling lighter, as if he had finally closed a chapter in his life. It was time to start a new one that would see justice served. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in Marcus's life. He strode into the hospital, his mind focused on the day's surgeries, but as he approached the administrative wing, he noticed hushed whispers and sideways glances from his colleagues. Something wasn't right. Dr. Steele called the hospital administrator's secretary, her face carefully composed. "Mr. Jameson would like to see you in his office immediately." But Marcus felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "I'll go right away." The walk to Jameson's office felt like a march toward doom. Marcus's thoughts raced, trying to figure out what could have prompted this. He hadn't made any surgical mistakes, he was sure of that. His work had been flawless, especially since. His thoughts trailed off as he reached the door. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his coat and knocked. "Come in, Dr. Steele." Marcus entered the office to find Jameson sitting behind his large desk, his expression grave. "Please sit." As Marcus took a seat, Jameson cleared his throat. "Dr. Steele, we've received an anonymous complaint regarding your conduct. We have no choice but to suspend you pending an investigation." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Suspension? Investigation? What was happening? But as the shock set in, his mind began to work. Anonymous complaint. Garrett's threat echoed in his memory. "I have friends in high places." Instantly, Marcus knew who was behind this. Instead of anger, a cold smile spread across his face, making Jameson shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I understand," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'll fully cooperate with the investigation. May I ask what the complaint is about?" Jameson, relieved by Marcus's calm response, explained, "The complaint alleges inappropriate behavior with patients and possible substance abuse. I want to stress these are just allegations, but we must take them seriously." Marcus nodded, already formulating a plan. Garrett had overplayed his hand. These accusations were so far from the truth that they would be easy to refute. And in the process, Marcus might even find a way to turn the tables. "Of course," Marcus said, standing. "I assume you'll need my badge and access card for now." Jameson nodded, looking both relieved and perplexed by Marcus's composed demeanor. "Yes, thank you. And Dr. Steele, for what it's worth, I hope this all clears up quickly." Marcus handed over his credentials, feeling oddly unburdened. "So do I, Mr. Jameson. So do I." As he left the hospital, his head held high despite the curious, pitying stares from his co-workers, Marcus felt an eerie calm settle over him. This was Garrett's move, and it had been a sloppy one. Now it was his turn. The parking lot was almost empty as Marcus approached his car, the setting sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. Just as he reached for his car door, a voice called out from behind him. "How does it feel to lose everything, Doc? Your wife, your job. You should have just gone along with it." Marcus turned slowly, facing Garrett, who leaned against a nearby car, a smug grin plastered on his face. For a moment, Marcus was tempted to punch that grin right off, but he held back. He had a better weapon than fists. "You've made a serious mistake," Garrett, Marcus said, his voice cold and steady. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Garrett's smirk wavered briefly before he forced a chuckle. Big words for a man who's lost everything. "Face it, Steele, you're done." Marcus allowed himself a subtle, knowing smile. "We'll see about that." As Garrett strutted away, confident in his supposed victory, Marcus felt a surge of determination. Garrett had no idea of the storm that was brewing, the evidence Marcus had gathered. The battle was far from over, and Marcus Steele wasn't playing to lose. The wheels of justice, Marcus had learned, turned slowly, but they did turn. In the weeks following his suspension, he set his plan into motion with the precision of a skilled surgeon. His first step was to anonymously tip off the DA about Garrett's prescription fraud. Using a burner phone, he disguised his voice and made the call. "You might want to look into Dr. Garrett Sloan," he said. "Word is he's been handing out oxy scripts like candy." The DEA agent on the other end perked up. They had heard whispers about a doctor running a pill mill in the suburbs, but hadn't been able to pin down a name. "You got any proof?" the agent asked. Marcus grinned to himself. "Check his prescription records. Talk to some of his yoga students. You'll find they're more interested in pills than poses." As he ended the call, Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and justice. This was necessary. Next, he focused on clearing his own name. He had spent weeks compiling evidence records of every surgery he had performed, testimonials from patients and colleagues, even security footage proving he wasn't at the hospital during the times he was accused of misconduct. He presented this mountain of evidence to the hospital board, along with proof that Garrett had fabricated the allegations against him. The board meeting was tense. Marcus stood tall before the panel, his gaze steady. "I've dedicated my career to this hospital and my patients. I would never jeopardize that trust," he said. "The accusations against me aren't just false, they're malicious." He laid out his case piece by piece, watching the board members' expressions shift from doubt to shock to outrage. By the time he was done, the room was silent. The chairman cleared his throat. "Dr. Steele, we owe you an apology. Not only are you reinstated immediately, but we'd like to offer you the position of Chief of Surgery. Your dedication and integrity are exactly what we need here." Marcus nodded, gracious in his acceptance, but inside he was still seething. How quickly they had been willing to assume the worst about him, dismissing his years of service. As he left the meeting, he overheard two board members whispering, "Did you hear about Sloan? His medical license has been suspended. DA's involved." Marcus smiled to himself. The dominoes were falling into place. But his triumph didn't last long. That evening, while he was finally relaxing in his study, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. Marcus, the voice on the other end, was shaky, almost frantic. "Vanessa? What do you want?" His voice was cold. "Marcus, please." "I need help," she said, her voice breaking with fear. "Garrett's gone crazy. He's threatening to release compromising photos of me if I leave him. I don't know what to do." Despite everything, despite the betrayal, Marcus felt a flicker of concern. He had loved Vanessa once, and he couldn't just ignore her plea. But he wasn't naive. This could be an opportunity. "Stay calm," he said, already devising a plan. "I'll take care of it." After hanging up, Marcus leaned back, feeling the pieces come together. He had dismantled Garrett's life piece by piece, and now it was time for the final confrontation. The park was deserted, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. Marcus stood near an old oak tree, hands in his pockets, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. Garrett stormed across the lawn, his face twisted in rage. The once smooth, talking yoga instructor was now a desperate, dangerous man on the edge. "You think you've won?" Garrett snarled, stopping just in front of Marcus. "I'll ruin both of you." Marcus remained calm, his voice even. "It's over, Garrett. I have proof of everything: your prescription fraud, your attempt to frame me, and now your blackmail. You've got two choices: turn yourself in and get help, or I'll take everything to the authorities and the media." Garrett's eyes widened, darting around like a trapped animal. For a moment it looked like he might consider the offer, but then something snapped. With a furious roar, Garrett lunged at Marcus, hands reaching for his throat. But Marcus was ready. His years of martial arts training kicked in as he sidestepped the attack, using Garrett's momentum to pin him to the ground in one swift motion, twisting his arm behind his back. "You're pathetic," Garrett, Marcus said, his voice icy. "You've lost everything, and it's all your own doing." Garrett struggled, cursing under his breath, but Marcus held him firm. In the distance, sirens wailed, getting closer. The police had arrived. As the officers pulled up, lights flashing, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was finally over. He gave his statement as they led Garrett away in handcuffs, the man still screaming threats of revenge, but his words were hollow now. He had no power left. One of the officers approached Marcus. "Dr. Steele, we'll need you to come to the station to give a formal statement." Marcus nodded. "I'll be there first thing in the morning." As he walked away, leaving Garrett and the chaos behind him, Marcus felt lighter. The anger and bitterness that had driven him for so long were fading, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He had faced his demons and come out the other side. Months passed. The seasons changed, leaves fell, snow came and went, and with each passing day, Marcus began to feel more like himself again. Or perhaps a new version of himself, stronger, wiser. He stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of eager medical students, their faces bright with hope and ambition. He remembered being like them once. "Ethics in medicine isn't just about following the rules," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the lecture hall. "It's about making the right choices, especially when those choices are the hardest." He noticed some students nodding in agreement, while others were furiously jotting down notes. Good, they were paying attention. "You will face difficult situations in your careers," he said. "Ethical dilemmas that no textbook can fully prepare you for. When that time comes, remember this: your integrity is your greatest asset. Protect it carefully." As Marcus wrapped up the lecture and answered a few questions from eager students, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. This was why he became a doctor, not for the praise or the paycheck, but to make a real difference and to help others. Once the hall emptied, Marcus checked his phone and found a message waiting from Vanessa. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope one day you can forgive me." He stared at the text for a long time, reflecting on the past, the pain, and everything they had been through. But in that moment, he also found closure. He typed a brief response: "I wish you well, Vanessa. Goodbye." As he sent it, Marcus felt the last remnants of resentment fade away. He realized that he had forgiven her not for her sake, but for his own peace of mind. The drive home was calm, and Marcus found himself reflecting on the turbulent journey he had just endured. He had lost a wife, yes, but in return he had gained something far more valuable: clarity, purpose, and a renewed understanding of who he was and what truly mattered to him. As he pulled into his driveway, he spotted a familiar figure waiting for him: Dr. Sophia Chin, a brilliant neurosurgeon, and for the past several months, his girlfriend. She smiled as he got out of the car, her eyes lighting up in a way that still made his heart race. "How was the lecture?" she asked, pulling him into a warm hug. "Good," Marcus replied, breathing in the comforting scent of her shampoo. "I think they actually paid attention this time." Sophia chuckled, a sound that never failed to brighten his day. "Of course they did. You're Marcus Steele, the ethical crusader and surgical wizard. How could they not?" As they walked into the house together, talking about their days and planning for tomorrow, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. This, he realized, was what he had been searching for all along: not revenge, not validation, but understanding, support, and love. The sun was setting over their suburban home, casting the sky in stunning hues of orange and pink. It marked the close of one chapter, yes, but more importantly, the beginning of a new one, a better one. Marcus Steele hadn't just survived, he had thrived. He had faced his challenges and come out stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And as he looked into Sophia's eyes, seeing the love and admiration reflected back at him, he knew that the best was yet to come. This is where our story ends. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click on the video on your screen to see more.